This is number 3 in our video about Spanish pronunciation. And we're coming on to a slightly new subject, which is all to do with rhythm. I've put all 3 words, rhythm, beat and emphasis, or stress is another one. There's 4 words for the same thing. Language is like music. If you had a musical score and you just played it without any rhythm, it would just be an awful sound. There wouldn't be any shape to it. You wouldn't hear the melody. And language is exactly the same. You need to understand the rhythm of the language for the sound to communicate. And in actual fact, often we don't pick up every single sound of a word, even in our own language. We tend to pick up the rhythm of speech, and that brings as much of a message as the words themselves or the specific consonants and vowels themselves. This is often what happens, even though it's an unconscious process. Now then, the difference between English and Spanish is that the rhythm in English words is completely arbitrary. There are no rules that tell us the difference between present and present, desert and dessert. We're putting the emphasis in a different part of the word. Let's take a word like liquid. If you called it liquid, you'd immediately make the word sound a bit odd. And it's rhythm that's giving these words their shape. But in English, there are no rules to govern where the rhythm goes. Spanish gives us rules. Spanish is a very regular language, and if we learn the rules, we know where to put the rhythm in the word. And once we know that, then we really know how to pronounce with confidence and know that we're getting our meaning over. The rules are based on syllables. Remember right at the beginning we talked about how the language is made up of syllables, each one surrounding a vowel sound. We looked at ma, me, mi, mo, mu, etc. And the rules are based on where the beat goes on a particular syllable. Here are the rules. Number 1. If a word ends in a vowel, that is a, e, I, o, u, which I hope you've been practicing, or the letter S or the letter N, the beat of the word falls on the last but one syllable, or the penultimate syllable. And I've got 3 very simple examples here. We've got the word for book, libro, ends in a vowel, beats on the E. It's not libro, it's libro. That's where we hear the rhythm. We add an S, it doesn't change, so it's libros. A word ending in an S, which obviously in many cases is a plural, but not always. And the beat again is on the last but one syllable. Here's another example. It's a word ending in an N. Beat on the last but one syllable. The word means young, and it's joven. Joven. Remember what we said about our consonants, the ch for the J and the very soft v. Joven. Joven. It's not joven, it's joven. You might think that's a rather slight difference, but believe me, it's the difference between being understood and not being understood. And it would be the same if we did this experiment in English, you'd find it was the same. Okay, so that's rule number 1. Words that end in a vowel, an S or an N, the beat goes on the last but one syllable. Rule number 2 is that words ending in any other letter, the beat falls on the final syllable. The majority of words end in these other letters. The D, the D, the J or J, the L or L, the R or R, the Y, which is called Y, although it's changed its name now, it's called Y, but that's another story, and the theta, the Z. There are a few other letters with which words end, but it's more limited in Spanish than English in that sense. Okay. Words that end in these letters, the beat goes on the final syllable. And I've got an example of each one for you. We've got ciudad, which means town or city. Ciudad, beat on the ending. Reloj. When you hear these words in a sentence at speed, the beat becomes even more noticeable. Reloj, reloj. Yeah, and remember we said that the ch could lighten to reloj or reloj, reloj. Beat on the ending. Azul, the word I mentioned before, meaning blue, beat on the ending because it ends in the letter L. Hablar. Hablar is the verb to speak. It's the infinitive form of the verb, and the beat falls on the ending. Hablar. Estoy. Here the final letter is the Y. Estoy. Estoy, putting the beat on the ending. And finally the word for happy, feliz. These are just a few examples, but it's completely regular. There are no exceptions to these. Rule number 3, and this is an exception, but it's not an irregular exception, it's something we can rely on. And that is that if any word breaks one of these rules, it's always indicated by an accent over the emphasized syllable. Spanish is a wonderful language. The written form helps us. It shows us how to pronounce. It's the exact opposite of English, where the written form often confuses us. In Spanish, it's clear as anything. So here's the word for Saturday, and it's sábado. We would be tempted to think, and a lot of people mispronounce it sábado, but there's an accent on the appropriate syllable, which is actually breaking this rule. So the syllable is, the pronunciation is sábado, sábado. Sofá is another one that breaks the rule, breaking the same rule number 1. It's got a vowel at the end, but it's an accented vowel. So instead of sofá, it's sofá, sofá. And finally, a word that breaks the second rule here, it's the word that ends in the letter L. So we would think it's fácil, but it isn't. It's fácil. Fácil means easy. Fácil. Fácil. Okay? The same thing happens, I haven't got it written here, but the same thing happens for the word difficult, which is difícil. We can rely on this. Not all Spanish people put accents correctly when they're doing their own writing. And also signs that are in capitals. There might not always be a room for an accent, but apart from those 2 exceptions, if you see the written word in a dictionary, in a book, you will have the accents there to tell you where the beat goes. And I would advise you to do one thing, and that is that when you're reading, even reading signs or anything, even though you in your own mind might be tempted to pronounce it with your own pronunciation, try always to get into the habit of looking at the vowels, looking at the consonants, and looking at the rhythm of the word according to these 3 rules, and getting the sound of it right, because that'll help to reinforce and also help your understanding. So, rhythm, very, very important, fundamental to the language, and these are the rules that govern it. There's more to tell you that doesn't contradict this, it just explains it a bit more, and that's coming up next in our lesson 4.